I am a climate optimist. Now, some people might say that that is a contradiction in terms. How can you put climate change, this significant challenge of chemistry, of our planetary chemistry, together with optimism, this sort of emotional state? And the reason why I'm a climate optimist is that I've dedicated my life to working for climate change and for social justice, and to attempting to create a future in which the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, become true. And in 20 years of doing that, I've discovered the only way to survive, the only way to get any sleep, the only way to keep going is to hang on to optimism, almost as if it was a life raft, almost as if it was a life jacket in the constant unrelenting challenge that we have, and the information and the data and the science that we have. Because our attitudes matter. We are human beings, after all. We are not machines, we're not computers, we're not data sets, we're people. And how we think and how we feel about this information, these challenges that we're faced, affects how we act. We might all think that we receive information, we consider the options, and then we take action on them. And that's not really how we work. We're not really sort of a Spock who's taking these logical decisions. We're kind of a bit more like Homer Simpson. And we have our emotions, and we have our family, and we have what we're seeing in the media, and we have whether we got a good night's sleep that night and what we ate, and we have our history, and we have our preconceptions, and crucially we have the cultures within which we are raised and within which we work and live, all of which affect how we take action on what we do. So that's what we're here to talk about today. I wrote a book on this called The Happy Hero. And I also, over in 2017, and then again this year, in partnership with Ipsos Mori, the global market research company, I surveyed 26,000 people around the world. And those 26,000 people, from China to India to Brazil to North America to Colombia to Mexico to the UK, France, Germany, South Africa, all around the world, we asked people whether they believe we can still do something about climate change. Not if they care, not if they think it's important, but whether they think we can still act. Now, the good news was that a significant proportion of people, over 40% of people, still believe that we can do something about climate change. And again, whether that is solving climate change, mitigating climate change, adapting to climate change, that we still have the power to act in order to combat the climate crisis. There is a percentage of people, 20% of people, who believe that we could, but we probably won't. I consider these to be sort of technological optimists. They believe that we have the technology, that we have the science, that we have the solutions, but that people themselves might not take the right decision. And only 4% of people around the world are deniers. They're pretty loud on my Twitter feed, but they're actually only 4% of people around the world believe that there's no need to do anything because climate change isn't happening. But what shocked me the first time I did that survey, what shocked me to my core was this percentage of people who are now fatalists, who believe that this ship has sailed. Whether they are experiencing, whether they believe they are experiencing climate change effects or not, this is, for a significant proportion of these people around the world, this is received, it's what they're reading in the media, it's what they personally believe, it's what they're hearing, and they believe that we can no longer combat the climate change crisis. And they're young. In fact, in some countries, it goes up to 30% of our young people, up to 30% of our under 30s believing that we can no longer do anything to combat climate change. Now, those aren't the Fridays for Future campaigners who are out in the streets. I've worked with them, I've done creative campaigns for them. They're angry, they're rageful, they're terrified, but they still believe that something can be done. Otherwise, they would not be out there campaigning to do it. That is the very act of outrage and anger and demand for change suggests you believe change is still possible. Nor are they the young people who are coming to work for me. They're not the young people that I engage with every day who are passionate, want to work full-time all around the world in making this happen. They're more likely to be on lower incomes, and they're all around the world. And they are not speaking about their fatalism. They're making memes about being the last generation. They're posting online about there not being any point doing anything because climate change is the end of it all anyway. They're telling jokes about it. But that mindset of doomed, that mindset of fatalism is fatal to action. Because if you think there's no point in doing something, then why would you do anything? If you think there's no point in doing something, then why would you do anything? These are not people who are taking behaviours in their own home. They are not people voting or demanding change for their leaders. These are not people who are investing or inventing or deciding to go and work in this movement. The mental health toll on these young people who believe that there is no point doing anything anymore, that choice has been taken from us, is significant. So the very first thing I would like to ask, and I hope everybody's introducing themselves in the chat. The very first thing that I would like to ask is, where are you on that scale? So we are going to get interactive on Vimeo. So could you please bring up the Vimeo question? We are going to ask you to answer emotionally. Don't answer scientifically. We've got a question we're going to be sharing with you about where you feel on this. Do you feel we can and we will do something? We can and we might. We can and we won't. Or actually, there's nothing we can do about climate change anymore. We're doomed. We're going to bring that question up right now. We will ask you to answer with your gut. Now, this is a Royal Institution event, and so I'm asking you not to ask a whole lot of scientific questions about what does combat mean? What does climate crisis mean? You understand the question sort of with your heart, with your gut, and answer it. And we'll see where we are now in terms of whether we believe we can solve climate change or not. So hopefully that question has come up. I'm going to flick to my other screen and just check whether we've got the answers coming in yet. Quite see any answers coming in. I'm going to ask Martin or the team if answers are coming in to put them in my chat so I can see them, because I can't quite see them on my screen. Lovely. I'm just going to refresh. This is us getting really excitable on Vimeo and trying to be interactive. If you could send them to me, that would be great. Thank you. So I'm going to ask that question again at the end, and we'll do a comparison to see whether our wonderful speakers have managed to change anything. And if you also would like to understand more about some of this impact, particularly on mental health, I really strongly recommend that you read the new paper, a collaboration between the Grantham Institute and the Institute for Global Health Innovation, which is called An Introduction to Climate Change and Mental Health, a paper by Climate Cares. That's An Introduction to Climate Change and Mental Health, a paper by Climate Cares, which is absolutely fascinating on the mental health toll, both the mental health toll in terms of from the impacts of climate change on the trauma from those experiencing flooding and wildfires, all the way through to that anxiety amongst young people that I explained. I've seen the votes coming in. We have quite a few strong optimists who believe that we can and we will combat climate change. The majority of us are somewhere in the middle. We can and we might, or we could, but we probably won't. And then we've got a few people online who are feeling that sense of fatalism and that sense of doom, that actually there isn't anything which else we can do. So actually those breakdowns of what we as a group on this call is very similar to what we're seeing worldwide, which I found fascinating. Now, just before I get to my amazing speakers to really deep dive into this setting, I just want to share with you a short video address from an incredible change maker, Eliane Wanjiku, who is a driving force behind planting 250,000 trees in Kenya, because when she was in kindergarten, when she was in junior school, she learned about environmental activist, Kenyan environmental activist Wangari Maathai, and the work that she did. And in 2004, as many of us know, she became a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. And Eliane decided to follow in her footsteps. So one of the reasons why Eliane is not with us is that she is 10 years old. So she has very kindly prepared this video to share with us, because I suspect it's probably a little past her bedtime. So let's hear from such a young optimist, such a young change maker, and then we'll continue on with our debate.
Yale College. My name is Eliane Grinto. I'm 11 years old from Peconia's Peptree, and I love planting trees. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference, and thank you very much for all the support. Hi everybody. Right now I'm in an urban green space, which used to be a total catastrophe. When I first saw a picture of it, I was flabbergasted by the way all the garbage is here. It used to be a junkyard. You could even say it was a mortuary for the junk. Right now it has changed completely. We have cleaned it up. So all I'm gonna say is that if something used to be a junkyard and now it's this, then what can you do to your country? And what can you do to the sea? What can you do to the seas? What can you do to your rivers? Come on, you need to think. This was a junkyard, and now this is it. I'm standing here with a river and two beautiful trees behind me, like that, and a pathway. If that could happen in such a short time, why can't you make a change for your place or country?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I'm a climate optimist. There's little girls like her, and the simplicity with which she sees such a complex challenge, which is we can all do something about it, even if it's something very small. And the incredible privilege that I have to interact with so many young people around the world like her, that gives me that sense of hope. Now, hope, doomed. Are we doomed? How do we mentally prepare ourselves and cope with and answer the climate crisis? I've got three incredible speakers. I've got 100 questions for them myself, but I promise you I will ask them your questions. So please do keep posting questions into the chat so we can make sure that this is as interactive as possible. And the first person which I'd like to invite forward to speak is Lorraine. Now, Lorraine is the director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation, CAST, and she's an environmental psychologist, and she specialises in the perceptions and behaviour, our perceptions and our behaviour in relation to climate change, energy and transport. And Lorraine has got some insights for us in terms of how do we communicate and talk about climate change, but also how do we think about climate change. Over to you, Lorraine.
Thanks very much, Solitaire, and it's really great to be here this evening. I'm just going to share my screen. Got a few slides, but there we go. So yeah, there's lots I could say on this, but I'll try and just stick to a few points. I think the first thing I want to say is that it's really important that we engage with people, and that it's important for at least two reasons. Firstly, engaging with people is key because a lot of what we need to tackle climate change will involve changing behaviour, changing lifestyles in pretty profound ways. So the UK Committee on Climate Change estimate that about 60% of the changes needed to reach our net zero targets, it will involve behaviour change of some kind. And actually, probably the figure is higher if you take account of the sorts of behaviour changes needed in a professional context. So the sorts of business decisions needed probably takes that figure even higher. So we will need to involve people in a number of ways in terms of changing their behaviour. So it's important to talk to people about those changes required. It's also important because even where the changes required to tackle climate change don't directly impact on people's lifestyles and disrupt their habits, where there will be wider societal change in terms of kind of energy supply, technologies, infrastructure, and so on, there might be costs, there might be risks to people, and we need to involve people in decision making about those changes as well. And what we know, crucially, is that the more we engage with a whole range of different people, including the public, the better decisions tend to be, actually, as well as the fairer they are, and so the more acceptable they are. So the more we can engage with people actually in the decision making around how to tackle climate change, the better. And doing that also builds a political mandate. So it actually helps policymakers take those bold steps if we can actually build social engagement with the issue. So where are we in terms of public engagement with the issue? Well, actually, concern about climate change has been steadily rising, and so we've seen this is just from UK data. We've seen kind of in recent years that actually concern has been tending to go up. It tends to spike when there are particular events around kind of extreme weather, but actually in 2019 we saw a peak really in public concern following the publication of the IPCC's significant 1.5 degree report, and in light of lots of Extinction Rebellion protests and Fridays for Future and other things hitting the media, as well as extreme weather events increasingly being in the media. So we've seen this kind of rise in public concern. And what's really interesting, I think, is that actually that hasn't gone away in light of COVID. So, of course, the last year and a bit, our attention has been focused more on the immediate pandemic. But concern about climate change amongst the public has not gone away. In fact, our polling suggests that it's even gone up a little bit during the pandemic. So the sense of urgency in addressing climate change has actually risen. And a lot of other polls show a similar sort of trend, that actually it's either stabilized or gone up a little bit. And also we're seeing that people are keen that the recovery from COVID is a green one, that we try and tackle climate change at the same time as addressing our recovery from the pandemic. But we always know that there is a gap between people's concern and their behaviour. There's often this say-do gap. So there are things we need to do to change behaviour, to encourage people, enable people to play a role in tackling climate change. And I won't go into lots of detail here, but very broadly, these can be categorised as downstream things where we're giving people information to inform their behaviour, their choices. And then more upstream things where we're trying to shape the context in which people are behaving. So making things easier and more available through economic incentives, regulations, and other sorts of things. And we need both downstream interventions and upstream. So we need information, but we need lots of other things as well. But just on the information side, how can we motivate people to change their behavior? How can we motivate people to be concerned about climate change and act on that concern? The first thing, crucially, is to target people's values. So understand what's important to them, because we know that information is always filtered through various sort of biases and heuristics. So in other words, you can give 100 people the same message and they'll all come away thinking slightly different things about that. That some of them will agree completely, some of them will completely disagree, and there'll be lots of people sort of somewhere in between. The reason is that we tend to gravitate towards information which reinforces what we already believe, and ignore information which challenges what we believe. So we need to tailor our messaging to resonate with what people care about. And marketers have known this for a long time, and they've often segmented their audiences. So they give different messages to people that care about the environment compared to people that maybe care about other things, and they market their products accordingly. Now, the good news here is that climate change actually will improve our lives in lots of ways, so that we can actually frame climate change messaging in ways that are very positive and in line with what people care about. So climate change actually can improve health, well-being. Potentially it can address equity, it can create green jobs, deal with security, and so on, if we get it right, that we can find solutions that address those things as well. And so what we know is that actually the more we can talk about these more these co-benefits, these wider benefits of taking climate action, the more we're likely to be able to motivate people to get involved and change their behaviour and support that action. So I think that's one of the key things, is actually tailoring our message to thinking about these wider benefits. And the final thing I'll say, because we've already touched on kind of mental health in relation to climate change, is that actually depending on how we measure climate anxiety, and so in some work that we've just done in the UK, we did a survey of the public to see how climate anxious they were, using a measure that had been developed in the US, which was quite a clinical measure. So it was kind of really taking a view about the anxiety being very disruptive to your well-being and your lifestyle. So items like thinking about climate change makes it difficult for me to concentrate. When we measure it in that way, we find that levels of climate anxiety are very low in the UK. So really just like, you know, a percent or so of the public are expressing that level of concern. But we do see that younger people tend to have slightly higher levels of climate anxiety. Now, it's not a huge difference, but so this figure down here shows that under 30s do have quite a lot higher levels of climate anxiety relative to other age groups, but still we're talking about pretty low levels. Now, for me, the really interesting thing is that we also see that there is a positive relationship between climate anxiety and taking green action, very broadly defined, so taking environmentally friendly measures. And so this finding, and a number of other studies that show this as well, suggests that actually maybe climate anxiety can be quite an adaptive response. It can be quite a positive motivator for taking steps to tackle climate change. So I think that's something that's maybe a bit surprising, and maybe we can talk about. So just to sum up then, I think lifestyle change is critical to tackle climate change, but also to improve our well-being. We can achieve that by engaging with people and understanding what's important to them, what their values are, and designing interventions with those values in mind, so actually achieving wider benefits. Implementing lots of different interventions to try and enable and encourage people to change their lifestyle, and channeling emotional responses to climate change into action. And I shall leave it there.
Lorraine, thank you so much. And I think that final point around, is climate change anxiety actually adaptive, is quite a point of discussion that I think we're going to dig into. That was a really great introduction to us, and thank you so much for sharing those slides. I'm going to hand over immediately to Amara Sawas, who joined Climate Outreach, an organisation which I worked with and absolutely love for the work that is done by Climate Outreach in 2021 as Director of Programmes and Research. Now, we're going to talk about what environmental psychologists are saying about this impact of climate on our well-being and some of the knock-on impacts of that into the wider areas of our society. So, Amira.
Thanks so much, Solitaire. I'm just going to open up my slides. Hopefully this should work. So I've broadened actually my presentation out today to focus a bit more on how we move from hope and fear debate to inclusive change. And in the spirit of being honest and open and engaging you all, for the first time ever, I've had a technological problem with my presentation. So I'm looking at my two screens, so just apologizing in advance if that looks a bit weird, but I'm fully with you on this. So I'm going to focus on how we can work with a whole of society approach on climate action. And I think Lorraine, you can see, it's not? Oh, it is to me. Okay, interesting. Let me see what I can do. Sharon. Let me try one more time. Okie doke, let me try this. Please do let me know if you can see. Okay, excellent. Sorry about that. Okay, so my background before I joined Climate Outreach, which is a climate communications charity, was working as a researcher and advocate predominantly in some of the countries that feel the strongest impacts of the climate crisis. And I can, totally empathize with why we've ended up in the fear space, the fear and shock space. And it's something we talked about quite a lot when I was doing that work. But I've sort of started to question whether that actually works as a tactic in some of the highest emitting countries, you know, where people are not necessarily seeing or feeling the changing climate as a crisis. And some studies that look at fear-based communications argue that this can actually backfire, causing individuals to kind of turn away from distressing information and think nothing can be done, as Solitaire sort of mentioned earlier. And other studies suggest that hopeful communications, sometimes they sort of allow people to psychologically distance themselves from the problem. So I think part of the issue here is that both sides of the debate are neglecting the complex dynamics between emotions and communications and how different individuals engage with climate change. Like, as Lorraine said earlier, strong emotions don't necessarily equate to strong actions, and different people respond to messages differently. And there are no magic words or magic facts. You know, we really have to think about how to have a, you know, engagement isn't really about just presenting facts, as we know people don't necessarily act. So how do I go to the next slide? There we go. So, I mean, what we've learned in research across multiple contexts is that, you know, people are motivated by shared values and identity and the joy of belonging. So, you know, asking whether hope or fear is better may not be the right question. Maybe thinking more about what emotions do we most want to kind of elicit or communicate through a particular campaign, but also taking into account how diverse audiences might respond. You know, as Lorraine was saying, you can have the same message go out to 100 people, but people might respond differently. So what we really need to do is understand how different people sort of relate to climate change, you know, respond to different messages, and are sort of open to acting. And we found that there are sort of three key things in order to do that. One is about, you know, effectively we want to speak to this kind of society in surround sound and encourage and motivate people to act on the climate, you know, on climate change as a collective. And so we need to find language that speaks to communal values, you know, that those that are most commonly aligned with concern for the environment. We need to build a shared identity, so communicating through channels that people across different audiences relate to. And we also need to actually employ a narrative structure. So rather than just presenting facts, you know, relying on facts, we need to kind of present stories of climate change that different kinds of people can relate to and see in their own lives. So, you know, some of the principles of strong communication around this are, you know, it's about engagement and people embodying themselves. So this, you know, climate action is who you are. It's what you care about as an individual, and other people like you agree with this. You know, when you do this, you belong more to your group and the world becomes more how you want it to be. So we kind of apply that through different projects. And I wanted to share some examples of that just to kind of bring this to life a little bit. So political ideology is an important one. You know, we've learned through multiple studies that people's values and their political ideology are much more fundamental in shaping views about climate change than any other factor. And so we have a study called Britain Towards Climate, which is in partnership with More in Common, the European Climate Foundation, and YouGov. And this involved research with over 10,000 British adults. And this looked at the population according to 7 segments. So they were identified through a core beliefs model. So 7 different kind of populations within the broader British population. And it looked at a range of psychological and ideological factors, including threat perceptions, social identity, and belief in meritocracy, for example. So it's more detailed than just kind of aligning people to left or right, or to, you know, vote leave or vote remain, for example. And sort of we learned that, contrary to some beliefs that, for example, that climate change is a culture war, it's actually seen as an issue for everyone. You know, everyone feels that it's sort of showing up in their lives in different ways, and everyone feels that we can act on it. And in the context of the UK, that the UK could be a leading on responding to it. So there's actually very little disagreement on that. And so basically, you know, we turn this into an evidence-based toolkit to help different organizations that want to communicate on climate change, to be able to communicate to those different audiences as separate stakeholders, but also as a collective. And interestingly, on the hope and fear bit, they were sort of split 50-50, but we sort of felt that that wasn't a useful marker in order to communicate with them, because there were sort of overarching disagreements which lay across and underneath those. So these are the 7 segments in summary here. I obviously don't have time to go into much detail about them here, but, you know, we did sort of notice that there were some clusters that were quite interesting. So, you know, there were ideological groups, the progressive activists and the backbone conservatives. There were sort of more disengaged groups, you know, left-leaning and right-leaning disengaged groups. There was one group that was really defined by attitudes towards crime and immigration, and that kind of is the lens through which they're seeing climate change and conversations around that. And there were two more groups that were engaged but a bit less ideological. So what we tried to do is have conversations with those groups about climate change and understand what, you know, how do they see a positive future around climate change? How do they want to act? You know, what works for them? And just to kind of, you know, very loosely deep dive into one. So, you know, we have this for all of the different segments, but the Civic Pragmatists is one example. So the Civic Pragmatists are interesting because they do care about environment, but they're slightly politically demotivated. So they do a lot, you know, around sustainability in their own lives, but they're not necessarily acting on that in their political choices. So, you know, we have deeper information here, for example, that, you know, looks into different elements of how you speak to the civic pragmatists and how you sort of communicate and sort of have an engaging conversation that focuses on sort of positive climate action. And then we have recommendations. So, you know, in the context of this stakeholder, it's about building confidence. So persuading them about the importance of their voice and the kind of political decision making, you know, as one example. And one thing that was quite interesting is we went back to the Britain Talks Climate segments and spoke to them about the impact of COVID-19. And what we found that was quite interesting was that quite a number of them agreed that people that would normally disagree with each other agreed that, you know, the government in the UK should choose to tackle pollution and climate change in the recovery from COVID-19. So there are areas of alignment and hope, but we just need to kind of maintain that conversation and that dialogue. So another area that we've worked on that's quite interesting is faith-based narratives. So, sorry, just jumping back. So faiths represent, you know, the 5 major faiths represent about 73% of the world population. So, you know, each faith is some of the biggest kind of identity groups that you can find in the world. And these will cross political, ideological divides. So, you know, we feel it's quite a useful way to engage people across the political spectrum and across divides on the issue of climate change. And we worked with faith leaders and faith communities and some research and found that there was actually strong kind of common messages across, you know, the 5 sort of dominant faiths around sort of restoring balance, you know, purity, the importance of the earth and, you know, the harmony of the earth. So, you know, just bringing it back to this issue of, you know, what communication works, you could put the narrative arc through a particular faith identity and work with the community to build a story that resonates with a wide range of stakeholders. And through this work, we found that actually there were 10 components for faith-based narratives that can unify people across the political divide towards climate action. And, you know, we'd love to take that work forward in future. And, you know, we have a guide, you know, online based on this work and other resources which might be useful if anyone's interested in having a conversation around that. And the final area that I'm just going to touch on briefly today that is really important is around visuals. So my colleague Toby, who runs our climate visuals program, he'll talk about the fact that climate change has an image problem. So a lot of research around climate with, you know, different publics has found that the image that comes to mind first for many people is the image of polar bears, which is actually quite psychologically distant for people, you know, regardless of context globally. And so we need to start kind of thinking about ways that the imagery can connect people with their, you know, with climate change and it resonate with their everyday lives. So based on some social science research, we developed something called climate visuals, the 7 core principles for climate change communication, which you can see here. So for example, you know, if we're talking about the context of the UK, we want to show local impacts of climate change here because just seeing international images may not relate to everybody, you know, everybody that we're trying to engage with. And finally, you know, we have a climate visuals webpage. And so basically this is an index of hundreds of images which are open access for different stakeholders who want to use imagery to convey messaging around climate change in a positive and impactful way. And each of the images on this website is indexed according to the principles, and it speaks to which principle it relates to and why this is important for engagement. So I'd encourage anyone to sort of check that out because it's a sort of open access source that is sort of Creative Commons licensed for different stakeholders to use. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And our website's here if you want more information about the different programs that we work on. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. Particularly that point about the visual. So many of us who work in this are very, should we say, data or wordy, but actually so much of climate change is about what we see. And that sort of bypasses straight into the heart sometimes. So I'm going to invite our final speaker, our final provocateur, the final insight, before we get into the debate. Lorenzo Grinto is the Associate Professor for, bear with me, the Associate Professor of the Practice of Global Public Health and the inaugural Director of the Planetary and Global Health Program at the St. Luke's Medical Center, College of Medicine in the Philippines. And I love the Planetary and Global Health Program. What a fantastic combination of those two terms, of our health and the planet's health in one. So Renzo is going to give us the insight from the Philippines, from a community who are feeling the impacts of climate change and what that means to sort of hearts and minds. Renzo.
Thank you so much, Solitaire, and thanks to the organizers, the Grantham Institute and the Royal Institution for this wonderful opportunity. It's already 2 a.m. here in Manila. But when I got an invitation, it's just so hard to say no, because this is a very important topic to discuss. And so I really feel privileged to be part of this convening. For the next several minutes, I'll be giving, as Solitaire already mentioned, a different perspective, perspective from this part of the world, the opposite side of the world, and perhaps a country that is not anymore just talking about climate change. It's not an issue that is anticipated, tomorrow, but it's already being felt by many people today, and especially when it comes to mental health. And Amira talked about the power of visual. So I decided to start with my talk by showing to you the beauty of the Philippines, its natural ecosystems, which unfortunately are now being threatened by the existential crisis of climate change. The Philippines has always topped, or has been always ranked as some of the happiest people in the world, depending on which poll or survey you're looking at. But unfortunately, this happiness of the Filipino people, in addition to the natural beauty of the country, are already under threat, because unfortunately the Philippines, as we already somehow mentioned, is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. It has always been at the top 10, in the top 10 of the climate risk index, for instance, that is annually published by German Watch, an international NGO. And here is the map of Southeast Asia, which is where the Philippines is located. In this map, the redder the country is, the more vulnerable the country is to climate change. Unfortunately, my country, the Philippines, is the reddest of them all. And so it just tells you, again, through visuals, how vulnerable the country is to the long-term impacts of climate change. And over the past year, and of course, I would like to acknowledge as well that, we're having this conversation in the middle of the pandemic. The pandemic is far from over, which also has generated its own pandemic of, mental health, stress and loneliness. And the Philippines has experienced this dual crisis of COVID and climate at the same time. And, Filipinos, especially the poor and the marginalized, have had to confront this dilemma. On the other hand, do I stay in the house, protect myself from the unseen coronavirus, while my house is being inundated by extreme flooding and the roof of my house being blown away by the strong wind? On the other hand, do I move to these evacuation centers, temporary shelters, to protect myself from the flooding and the strong winds, but facing a high risk of getting the virus, because as you can see in these shelters, there's no social distancing to begin with. And so this is a real crisis. And you can imagine that Filipinos are facing this dilemma and this mental stress, this anxiety, this frustration that they have, that are being brought about again by this confluence of two crises. We know climate change is going to affect the health of people. And I'll not belabor you with the details of this diagram. It just shows to you that there are many pathways that link climate change to a wide range of health outcomes and more, especially physical health outcomes. But as you can see there, mental health, mental illness is also another aspect of health that cannot be forgotten. And I'm glad that, you know, for instance, several of us in the panel are already working on this climate change and mental health nexus. And Solitaire, you mentioned at the start of the program that, you know, Climate Cares, which is based in Imperial, where I also sit in its advisory board, has just released this report on the intersection of climate change and mental health. And I'll not go into the details of this diagram. I invite our listeners and viewers to visit the website of Imperial to get access to this report. But as you can see, again, climate change will impact mental health in many different ways. And some of these different ways are already being felt in the Philippines. And I'll show some slides to demonstrate that. So part of the Philippines' perennial vulnerability to climate change is its experience and its you know, experience with extreme weather events such as typhoons and extreme flooding. This photo was taken in 2013 when Typhoon Haiyan, which is the strongest typhoon to hit land in human history, came to the Philippines, claimed thousands of lives, affected millions more. And it did not destroy only infrastructure, livelihood, farmlands, hospitals, schools, but also affected the health of many people, including their mental health. And of course, you know, the Philippines has a rich experience, for instance, when it comes to providing psychosocial support to disaster victims, especially in these areas that are affected by natural calamities like typhoons and flooding. And, you know, this is a very powerful picture taken from, again, the ground zero of Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. This is quite, you know, even causing me goosebumps because the day after the typhoon, the Filipinos congregated and mobilized and even, prayed to God for protection, but also to give thanks and gratitude for sparing their lives and saving their loved ones. And Amira mentioned about the power of faith-based narratives. The Philippines has lots of that, being the only Catholic country in Asia and a very prayerful country. So we always say, you know, you can withstand any crisis, calamity, as long as, you know, you have a deep faith in God. Although I think in this era of climate change and in a much more modern society that we're facing, we have to look into, again, the links between religiosity and the effects on mental health and emotional well-being. I mentioned about the extreme weather events, typhoons, flooding, but we always have to remember that that is not just part of the climate story of countries like the Philippines and many other countries, because the Philippines, along with many other developing countries, are already seeing the slow onset effects of climate change, such as sea level rise. The melting of the ice caps in the poles lead to, again, the rising of the sea level, which then inundates a lot of the coastlines, for instance, in archipelagic countries like the Philippines. In fact, the Philippines is seeing some of the fastest rate of sea level rise in the world. And I personally had a chance to actually interact with communities. In fact, in this picture, they were telling me there used to be a house in this part, but now it's gone. And it's not just infrastructure that is being washed away or eaten by the sea, as they will put it, but also it creates some degree of eco-anxiety, this feeling of hopelessness, and this idea that the future is uncertain. They don't know if there will still be enough fish to harvest or to catch, or is the drinking water still going to be potable? Because as the seawater intrudes into the fresh water, it becomes more salinized, meaning high in salt, which can also lead to its own health consequences. And then another of the slow onset impacts of climate change is increasing ambient heat temperature, and which can lead to crop failures. As you can see, the land is getting drier and drier by the day. And that will definitely impact not just the food security of the country, but also the mental and physical and even financial health, for instance, of our farmers, who unfortunately are some of the most impoverished groups in places like the Philippines. So given this scenario of this climate scenario, this climate reality, the question now is, are countries like the Philippines ready to address mental health, and specifically the mental health challenges brought about by the climate crisis? And unfortunately, this is the situation. And I think we have lots to learn from places like the United Kingdom. You tell me what's the situation. But in the Philippines, only 3 to 5% of our national health budget is spent for mental health. There's a huge shortage or short supply of mental health workers, 2 to 3 mental health workers per 100,000 population. But there is hope, because in 2019, the country passed a new mental health act, which hopes to establish community-based, comprehensive, and integrated mental health services, and to make them accessible to the Filipinos, especially in the context of a changing climate. And of course, we should not forget, which I already mentioned a while ago, yes, climate change is going to affect the brains and the hearts of Filipinos, but COVID-19 is already doing that as we speak. There's a huge mental health toll among Filipinos and other peoples around the world. But also, this is an interesting factoid about the Philippines. The Philippines is the social media capital of the world as well. Around 4 hours a day is being spent by every Filipino looking at the phone, looking at their Facebook and Twitter. I think there's even more, phones, and as you can see, 76 million have, or 72 million have Facebook accounts. We have 110 million people in the country, and social media itself is a driver of mental health problems. And so we need to ensure that when we look at the impacts of climate change of mental health, we look at it at a much, from a much broader, view, that this is really an interplay of climate, of COVID, of social media, of poverty, of violence, and all these other drivers of mental stress. And then I'm reaching the end of my talk, and, we're talking about how can we, channel this eco-anxiety into climate action. And I think that the young people of the Philippines are showing that. A lot of young Filipinos are coming together, forming climate youth networks, and do climate action in ways big and small. They will be the next leaders of the country, but they are now acting and not waiting until they, become the leaders themselves. And finally, I think there's an opportunity for exploring nature-based solutions for mental health. There's growing evidence that the increasing exposure to greenness, but also to blueness. There's even a term, blue-green prescribing, is actually good for health, not just the physical, but also the mental. And a country like the Philippines, which has a lot of greens and blues, being an archipelagic tropical country, there's so much potential for nature-based solutions to be part of our toolkit towards improving the mental health of our people. So we always say that the Filipino spirit is waterproof, as you've seen already in some of the pictures a while ago. But we need to make sure that the Filipino spirit and the spirit of the world's peoples will continue to be waterproof or heat-proof in the era of climate change by making sure that the future, not just waves, but future tsunamis of climate-related health consequences, both the physical and the mental, are being averted through our climate action, not tomorrow, but now. So together, let's advance the health of people and the planet. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much. That was very insightful. And also, as always with some of this, I found out things about the Philippines and what you're facing, which challenging, overwhelming, and if I may say, you presented that with an upbeatness, enthusiasm, and a smile on your face, even though it's difficult to watch. I'm seeing on the comments, I was reading through the comments as we're going, how much of an emotional roller coaster we all go through with all of this, from how do I deal with all of this, through to, no, I can still do something, to, no, it's their fault, they're the ones those guys up there, to, oh, is there anything which I can do as an individual that matters, to, oh no, there's a whole big problem over here that I didn't even know was happening, to, but no, we can do something, you got to capture this and you got to keep going, through to the, no, I believe we can. The whole gauntlet of human emotion that we run through when we're dealing with this planetary emergency. And sometimes when you're, one little human being living for the 40 or 10 or however many years we get nowadays, one of 7.5, soon to be 8 billion human beings, facing something which is planetary size, it can really make you feel quite small as an individual when you're facing a planetary size challenge that seems so complicated. But I think we've got some real insights on this call in terms on this webinar so far, in terms of what we can do about that. Because of course, when it comes down to it, each of us will have our own mental architecture, our own mental armor that helps us take action. And Lorraine put forward this insight into the fact that concern is rising, and that it's different, and that we're different. And it's, as someone who's sort of spent 20 years as a communicator, quite a lot of my job is reminding people that what motivates them might not be the thing that motivates the person that they're talking to. And that seems to be something which human beings a challenge with overcoming. So Lorraine took us through those segmented audiences and crucially the co-benefits of action, that taking action on climate change, that solving climate change seems to solve so much more in our health, in our job security, and then also that question of, is this anxiety actually adaptive? Amira took us through this incredible, powerful tool of belonging. And we all belong, even for a short period today in this conversation. We have a sense of community, from faith groups through to a sense of national groups, and perhaps even to some of the more specific identities, and the importance of the right stories and, of course, the storytellers within those groups. And then Lorenzo, this sense of the happiest people in one of the most beautiful countries, and both that happiness and beauty under so much threat from climate change. And we often talk about climate anxiety as this relatively amorphous piece. And I often think my climate anxiety often is more specifically a Twitter anxiety when I'm reading all of these pieces of paper. But actually the people of the Philippines having very specific climate anxiety around salination, around access, and the climate anxiety around whether to go to a hostel or go to a protective environment during a climate event or not because of COVID. And then also closing on that blue-green health, this sense of nature neither as our victim nor nature as the enemy who's causing all of this, but nature perhaps as our ally, and nature-based solutions as being, actually, we've got a really, really big hitter on our team, which is nature itself, in terms of our own well-being and in terms of solving climate change. So I'd love to take some questions from the audience on all of that. And these can be very big questions around the science. We've got 3 PhDs here, very big questions in terms of these experts on the call, or perhaps even an immediate emotional question you have yourself about how to protect your own emotional well-being. And of course, what's going to motivate you and others most to take action.